medievals are much more concerned with eternity, and they think that time participates in eternity, such that if by means of your art, if you can make it spacious, if you can overcome time and slow time down in your literature, then you can get a glimpse of eternity.
Hello and welcome back to The Commonplace. As you know, in this 4th season, we have been talking about all things story. And as you might have guessed, I had to have an entire episode about my favorite storyteller, of course, Mr. C.S. Lewis. And so our special guest today is Dr. Jason Baxter. Hello, sir.
Hi.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited about this. So Jason wrote an excellent book called The Medieval Mind of C.S. Lewis, and it came onto my radar probably fall 2022. And just to have some fun, I told one of my best friends that there was one book I wanted for Christmas. That was all I was going to say. And sure enough, shout out to my friend Christy, who's definitely listening. She came across your book and just knew in her gut this was the book. And she did get it for me for Christmas. So I was your target audience. I love Lewis, and I know you love him too. So thanks so much for coming. For those who aren't as familiar with your work, or maybe your love of these great writers, could you tell us a little bit about the books you write and how you came through what I call the classical wardrobe?
Yes, I think I have been through the classical wardrobe. I went to University of Dallas and studied Latin and Greek and Italian. And then I went to Notre Dame and studied medieval literature in Italian. And I studied Dante in particular. And I was studying, this is more interesting than it sounds. I was studying the influence of Platonic writings on Dante.
Okay.
Now, the trick is that Dante didn't read Greek. And so he didn't have access to Plato. But he's really Platonic, even though he doesn't know it. And so I was studying this question, right? And the question is how all this Platonic thought got to Dante, who didn't know Greek. And as I was reading these things, reading all kinds of horrible authors that no professor would inflict on any student, like Chalcidius and Macrobius and Dionysius the Areopagite and Boethius, a little bit better known. Mm-hmm. I was doing that during the day. And then at night, I had little kids. I was reading to them the Narnia books. And I kept having this funny feeling where kind of like a double take, like, wait a minute, I could have sworn I just saw that in Chalcidius earlier today. Like, is that Macrobius? And when I started looking into this, lo and behold, C.S. Lewis's daytime job was teaching medieval literature. Mm-hmm. And his specialty was showing his students how Chalcidius and Macrobius and Marcianus Capella and Bernard Silvestris and Alan of Lille influenced the better-known authors of the poets like Dante, like Chaucer. And so that's really what the medieval mind of C.S. Lewis is about. It's about how the books that he wrote for children, for adults, the fiction, but also the apologetics are more medieval than we would have expected. And as I like to say, that his books were successful, blockbusters, not despite his day job, but because of it.
I love that. I actually ended up buying Chalcidius after all of the footnotes in the Medieval Mind.
Oh boy.
Yes, I'm still slowly working through it.
Wow.
But I couldn't not after how much it was footnoted in your book.
You might be the ideal audience, as you said, right? I don't think anyone's ever done that.
Yes. I have. I could probably pull it off from above my head right now. Yeah, it's like right up there.
Yeah, I'm going to start looking for it on your shelves back there. Yeah, I bet I can find it. Yeah.
Yeah, I am definitely your ideal audience. And again, I love the book. And as with every episode that we've had this season, I will put any links to Dr. Baxter's works in today's episode notes for everyone else so they can hopefully trace these books down, track them down. Yeah. Okay, so you open your book with a really great observation in which you say that most of us know Lewis as the great storyteller, the fiction writer, and that's going to be most of my audience. We know him as the Chronicles of Narnia guy, the Screwtape Letters, and then another set, we know him as the everyman theologian. He gave the wartime addresses, he has mere Christianity, things like that. But then there's this other part of Lewis that most of us don't know as well, and that's this medieval mind part of him. And you rightly note that, of course, he was breathing the air of the Middle Ages and that he called himself the last dinosaur. But for my audience, who maybe doesn't hang out anywhere near the air of the Middle Ages and doesn't have a handle on what is the medieval mind or the medieval imagination, could you give us a couple of distinguishing characteristics between the medieval mind and the modern mind?
Yeah, I'm going to take a shot at medieval mind first and then get to the modern. I say that the single best image for thinking of the medieval mind is to think of a cathedral.
Mm.
And if we think that cathedrals, I mean, this alone might be a telling difference enough. If you think of what medievals invest their resources in, they spend monies on cathedrals like we spend money on weapons or particle accelerators or football stadiums. But
Yes.
they spend it on cathedrals. And so I like to call the cathedrals sort of medieval particle accelerators, right? You know, in these sort of like, you know, in like CERN, Switzerland, there are these huge laboratories, right, that are like 25-mile radius. And we accelerate these particles almost to the speed of light and then collide them into each other. So that for a split second, we have this sort of pure miasma of energy before it recoalesces to atoms. We can discover what reality is in its secret core. The medieval mind somehow feels that literature and cathedrals do that type of function. For a brief moment, almost think kind of biblically, right? I can catch a glimpse out of the corner of my eye, the back of God's cloak, or at least something divine. That and I like to put it this way, is that medievals are much more concerned with eternity, and they think that time participates in eternity, such that if by means of your art, if you can make it spacious, if you can overcome time and slow time down in your literature, then you can get a glimpse of eternity. And Boethius gives this extraordinary definition of eternity, which I'll repeat twice because it's very dense but very beautiful. He says that eternity is the simultaneous possession of the fullness of life. It's the simultaneous possession of the fullness of life. And Boethius says that most oftentimes we make the mistake. We might think that I'll drink a magical elixir and now I'll live forever. But that's not forever. That's just in perpetuity, because we're still locked in time with moment after moment after moment after moment. Whereas true eternity is all that is good and all that is just and all that is beautiful enjoyed in simultaneity. And that's the vision of God. And so a medieval work tries to create that rich complex to the extent it can to overcome time. And we could begin sort of, tracing out these things. Thus, I think they feel closer to their ancestors than we do, because they believe that they're in this great sort of cloud of witness. They're near them. They feel a sort of sense of filial obligation to be just and pious to their ancestors. They believe that artistic endeavors matter, and not just because of emotions, but because it could give us some sort of insight into divine things. And so if you think about this cathedral as the sort of as the chief image, two really interesting things happen. One cosmological and two psychological. Cosmological. Lewis uses this wonderful idea of a symphony in an age before electronic recording. That if you go and hear a wonderful symphony like Gustav Mahler's First Symphony, and there's 400 instrumentalists, which there are. So if you go and listen to something like Gustav Mahler's First Symphony, and want to hear it again, in an age before electronic recordings, what you have to do is you have to buy it scored for a piano. And you sit down and you play it, and if you get to know it well enough, you close your eyes and play it. And sometimes when you press the G, it reminds you of the flute. But sometimes when you press the G, it reminds you of the violin. But you have to know the symphony. You have to know the paradigm, the form, the model, in order for the piano to make sense. Lewis says that the medievals thought that our physical world of time and physics and gravity and everything that we're forced to study in school so well, that's the piano key. And the symphony is the eternal and invisible world, which is desperately trying to get itself to the extent it can into this world. And so our medieval ancestors weren't surprised when they had moments of beauty. We're sort of surprised by them and think, oh, well, it must be something I ate, or it must be, I'm in a good mood today. Or we have all these, naturalistic, reductivist, psychological answers. But the medievals thought that this would be the spiritual realm to the extent it can, trying to make itself manifest in a lower world with, as he calls, a smaller vocabulary.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, in terms of psychology, precisely because our souls are rooted in that eternity, then the experience of beauty is a guiding experience, and it's also intimately connected with goodness. That is, they don't think that you can actually be good unless you first encountered a transcendent vision of beauty. Then you will be good. So a lot of people would say that our medieval ancestors were more integrated than we are. They had more holistic thinking. that their scientific pursuits and their ethical pursuits and their theological pursuits were woven together, and it was all beautiful, and it was good, and it was true simultaneously.
Mhm.
So a lot of the times when we're trying to our classical educational curricula are trying to recreate something like that experience. Now the cool thing is that we can do it in modern ways. That is, we can have sort of advanced science and contemporary math and contemporary science, but the overarching vision of the integration is, in some sense, the gift of the classical education, right?
Mhm.
In contrast, we moderns, we tend to think of our world in terms of machines, and we tend to think of ourselves in terms of machines and our souls. We worry about our productivity values, right? We try to optimize our efficiency. We talk about ourselves like we're work functions,
Right.
and which means we secretly measure our success and our value. I think this is really significant for homeschooling moms in terms of how much we contribute to the economic development, right? And thus we're told that we're not important and we're not valuable if we're not actually contributing to the GDP. Because again, I think Lewis's sort of insight in his great Cambridge address in 1954 when he took this chair was that we've now spent more time around our machines than we have around natural things, and thus it's secretly snuck into our vocabularies and our metaphors and controls how we think and feel about the world. Those are two very quick contrasts, but you could say the icon versus the engine,
Mm.
or the cathedral versus the machine. And if you could unpack those two metaphors, then you could explain this whole rich sort of set of consequences for how we think and feel and what we value and what we devote our lives to pursuing and cultivating.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's really helpful and really excellent when we can take something down like that. We had another interview with a different writer, Rachel Woodham, earlier this season, and she was giving just helpful advice for choosing stories for your family. And one thing she said, which actually reminded me of how you described Lewis's Cosmic Imaginary, was to look for books that show the world as a festival, not as a machine. So like we're looking for this integrated, harmonious whole as our presentation of the world. And of course, we know from Lewis, The Abolition of Man, that books oftentimes are supposed to be doing one thing, and they're really giving philosophy to our children long before they're able to decide if they
True.
would like to take that philosophy or not. And so I actually joke with The Abolition of Man that it's my favorite dystopian novel, because at the end, there are no more persons. But really, what we find now as we continue in education is that the things Lewis was worried about then have really, there's fruit now. We can see what's going on.
That's right.
And
I remember reading these dystopian novels as a teenager,
yeah.
and getting halfway through and wondering when the scary futuristic part would start, and then being horrified at what had happened. That I had read half of a dystopian novel and thought, when does the weird futuristic stuff start?
When's it coming? This is just like still like my life. Yeah.
Yeah. When does the
Absolutely.
Brave New World start?
Right,
This is just
exactly. Yeah.
what I've grown up with. Yeah.
Right. I am someone who thinks that we are very much more Brave New World than like 1984 or something like that. We're definitely being lulled into the senses and pleasure and safety, or the appearance of it. But with The Abolition of Man, this is one thing we talked about a lot in season 3 when we were talking about virtue for our classical education series. We talk about how he notes that we're demanding the function of an organ we no longer have, that we've destroyed. And so I'm wondering if you can share more about Lewis's idea of the spirited chess, which is of course very Platonic, and the role of stories in forming one.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, we're fragmented. That's just a sort of medieval teaching. And to some extent, the goal of that moral life is to put those fragmented bits back together. And the medievals, at least Aquinas, called it an original justice, in which our different powers, with the so-called irascible powers located in the chest, which used well are my desire to achieve difficult goods. This happens with family, this happens with our work, right? This happens when I'm discouraged and I don't think I can actually finish a project. And every now and then we experience this halfway righteous anger, which think, you know what? No, doggone it. I'm going to finish this. Or no, we're not going to do this. Or no. And we sort of reach down into this well of energy and can achieve a difficult good. That's the chest. Those are the irascible appetites. But then there are also intellectual appetites and then sort of animal appetites. And the animal appetites for food, for drink, for procreation are not bad. They are just dumb. They're just brute. They're just animal. And just like an animal without a fence will just go, wander forever and never sate itself until it like eats too much and dies. So too, our animal appetites will always be there and are difficult to sate, and thus they need the sort of power of reason. And thus, at the end of Dante's Purgatorio, this is exactly what happens. Dante is crowned and mitred. That is, he gets both the sort of the king's crown as well as the papal tiara set on his own head. And he is called Lord of it and master of himself by Virgil. And Virgil tells him, whatever you desire now will be good, and whatever is good you will desire. He's re-achieved original justice, his broken and fragmented and piecemeal humanity, which we all live with on a daily basis. I want to be good in my head, and then I yell at my kids, or I fail this project. So finally, the shards and the fragments are put back together. Okay, how's that related to story? Well, stories are more than a collection of incidents, aren't they? In fact, Aristotle says this thing which sounds ultra boring and pedantic, right? A good story must have a beginning, a middle, and an end. But I think what's the insight going on there is the brilliance of a story is that it has a secret unity. And it takes fragmented bits and pieces, and sometimes they don't seem related, and it puts them all together. And thus, in some sense, story is coaching and how to create these moments of unity, these fragmented bits and pieces which try to escape us and bring it together into a sense of coherence. Lewis says, and this is so beautiful, this is in his very long, very interesting essay written in the 1940s called On Stories. It's something that he gave over and over again in various forms, and he gave it with a wonderfully secretive, Michael Ward talks about this, the wonderfully secretive title, the krypton element, by which he meant, or the kappa element, by which he meant the krypton element, or the secret hiddenness of story. But all he meant there, and it's rather an incredible thing to say, is that a good story, he says in a strange metaphor, is like a net that captures a bird. And this bird is like the bird of paradise, one of these wonderful sort of birds from Madagascar, right? But in this elaborate illusion, it's the bird of paradise is this fluttering piece of the soul. And the story creates this net in which this little sort of like spectrum of your soul, whether it is the desire for righteousness, or the desire for justice, or the heartbrokenness when you think about eternity, or the desire for true love or bravery or whatever it is. The story captures for a brief moment, he says, the fluttering bird of one of these spiritual values of the soul because of the unity of its pieces. That for Lewis is story in this very difficult, very strange. I'm increasingly convinced that Lewis was a right-brained learner.
What do you mean by that?
That is that he's creative, intuitive and artistic. But it's like, your creative, intuitive, artistic painter friend who says 14 brilliant things every time you talk to her, but you're not entirely sure how any of them are related. Reading On Stories, you think, I love every single paragraph, but you're just all over the place.
Right. Yes.
But in essence, I think what Lewis is trying to do is this kind of piece of psychology. And I think the really exciting thing, and maybe this will be very encouraging to your listeners, maybe even potential writers, is that Lewis doesn't think, this is wild, Lewis doesn't think that our ancestors have discovered everything that's down in there. The soul is like this subterranean cavern, and we've mapped a lot of it. And so to scrap our ancestors and start over, maybe you'll discover one thing, but they might have already discovered it. Anyway, they've discovered 700 things, right? So we have to read, and we have to have a sense of fidelity. But nevertheless, there's stuff down there that hasn't been mapped properly. And if we have a good writer, if we have a good storyteller, then we could potentially create a net to capture a new bird that we've never even seen before. And thus, in some sense, bring this gift to the great tradition. It's kind of exciting. Literature is more like science than you would think. It's experimental and laboratory.
No, I love that. I'm really glad to hear you say that you think On Stories also kind of jumps around, because when I read it, I was like, I'm not following a clear course here. I feel like I'm all over the place. I like it, yes, but I don't know where we're going right now. So that makes me feel a little bit better. But with Lewis at this point, correct me if I'm wrong, but when he was working on the lectures that eventually became the Abolition of Man, he was also at that point, the Inklings were starting to form in a more formal setting. And he started at this point to direct his work more towards story. Before, there'd been a lot of instruction and teaching. And then he wanted to start showing what he had been saying. So take the Abolition of Man and put it into That Hideous Strength, like start working towards this fiction. Are you able to maybe share a little bit about Lewis's life and work at this time, the things maybe he was reading or working through, the things in this relationship with the Inklings, the fellowship, and how it really impacted what became such rich stories?
Yeah, no, I think reading Lewis's on stories and Tolkien's on fairy stories at the same time is enlightening. You see that these are two friends who spend a lot of time talking to each other, and I don't know, like friends, almost kind of like a married couple, kind of like rub off on each other, and kind of plagiarize each other and steal each other's ideas, and you can definitely see, I guess in a more positive way, we'd call it cross-pollination or something like that, but yes, I mean, so it's definitely happening. I mean, Lewis is also working on That Hideous Strength, of course, which he mentions that these things are going on the exact same time. And I think to say that he wanted to show, in addition to talk about it, is exactly right. And Michael Ward makes a big point to this, right? Why all of a sudden did a middle-aged man, and toward the second, maybe the third quarter of his career, all of a sudden start to write children's stories, though he was not married and had no children himself. And Ward, and I think he's right about this, says that basically the answer is in Meditation in the Toolshed, another easy 4-page read.
Yeah.
That Lewis had this idea which had been important to him forever, right? This idea of what he calls, in one philosophical way, contemplation and enjoyment, by which, but in the Meditation on Toolshed, he does a better job of actually talking about that, because he uses a concrete metaphor, right? We can look along the beam, by which we can see the sky, but we don't see the beam anymore. Or we can step back and look at the beam as it comes through that broken crack in the tool shed and sort of suspended in the dust. And I think Lewis had done this intuitively the entirety of his teaching career. And so if you look at his boring scholarly essays, quote unquote boring, I think they're amazing.
Right.
But if you look at his scholarly essays, his academic essays, this is what he's doing the entire time. He gives you the look of the facts, and he tells you when these things were written, and he tells you what their lexicon was like, how many Latin terms of this or that they use, and so forth. But then he tries to get inside of that and reconstruct it and show what it all feels like from within. And so I think as a teacher, he's doing this on a daily basis, or at least a weekly basis in his lectures, and he loved to lecture. He hated to grade student papers, which makes me feel really good about myself, because I love to lecture and hate to grade papers. But anyway, I've got good precedent for that, for my vice. But yeah, but I think he eventually comes to realize that in order to give ourselves a fighter's chance, we're going to have to tell stories. And we're going to have to tell stories which are in this particularly flexible way of the fairy tale, or in his also the sci-fi, because they're open to transcendence, they're open to value, and they're open to a sense of longing. In other words, there are modern ways of recreating the porousness of the ancient medieval cosmos.
Yeah. Oh man, that makes me so happy. I love it. I thinking about along the beam. Isn't that basically what happens? Is it Voyage of the Dawn Treader that Lucy is looking along the beam of the mast in the ship? Do you recall? As I was listening to talk, we've just reread through Voyage of the Dawn Treader recently.
I did too.
And I think that's what Lucy does along the beam. But even in other parts of Narnia, I know I've shared before that it's often, I've just learned over and over in motherhood that to show my kids something rather than to tell them is always so much better, even as simply as, no one likes a rule, but everyone loves a story. And so to go around, and this is always my go-to, and say, oh, I don't like your tone, or we don't act this way, is one way to teach my children. But to say you're acting a lot like Eustace Scrub hits them at a different level. It means something to them. They have a picture of Eustace before he's actually met Aslan. Or even when Lewis, in the last battle, I was talking to my daughter recently. She's 6. She's my only formal student. And we were doing an Old Testament lesson. And I'm trying to explain basically the sacramental world, that the things, and this is of course very Lewis, the things point to and participate in a greater reality. And she stopped me and was like, oh, I know all about this. I was like, well, you're 6. Tell me about it. And she's like, oh, well, it's like in the last battle. When you go further up and further into Aslan's country, it's what you loved about Narnia, but this is the real Narnia. This is it. And I was like, there it is. Lewis teaching my child all of these huge ideas in the form of a story. And they're incredibly porous. My children love these stories. They are the air we breathe. And air is a big thing for Lewis. And I actually learned this, really got my head around it for the first time through your book. The atmosphere is incredibly important for Lewis when he's writing. And I'm wondering if you can kind of share some of those principles and ideas behind that, but maybe also how moms can use that as we think about the atmosphere of our homes, which is one of our 3 instruments of education in a classical Mason education.
Yes. I mean, I think if you think back to your favorite teachers, your favorite high school teachers, your favorite college professors or whatever, I think you'll discover that they did this at and along thing simultaneously. That is, the along people are interesting, but you can never figure out what they're trying to get at. And the at people will give you loads and loads of really clear notes, and you'll never do poorly on the exam if you study well. But you kind of have to drag yourself to class.
Right.
Whereas the at and along people are the classes that are packed out and that everyone loves. And so I think maybe that's just a cool, simple way to think about it is. And I think also just sort of the virtue of knowing yourself. We're all more either sort of like more creatively disposed, or like we'll make up a lesson plan on the drive to school if we're teachers, no confessions, right? Or we will pound in those facts until they're known. So it seems like at least knowing where we are on that spectrum also knows how we can try to achieve those opposite and complementary virtues to try to teach everything at and along. I think is a really powerful, and I think is a super classical thing to do. When you think about something as dry as, again, dry, I like it, as dry as the trivium. The trivium is constantly breaking down things into nuts and bolts and pieces, and it says that, there are 5 canons of rhetoric, and there are, 3 dispositions, and there are and then there's 260 schemes and tropes and so forth, right? But this is going to be something slightly older for high school kids. But I remember teaching once, and I was trying to tease through this list of schemes and tropes, and I was teaching chiasmus and hyperbaton and hypolage and polysyndeton, asyndeton, anaphora, antidiplosis, and all this kind of stuff. And the poor kids are like, what? Right. So I waited until they were exhausted, and then I pulled out this page of a narrative life of Frederick Douglass. We read it together, and I said, "Do you see any of those schemes and tropes on this 1.5 page?" And they started to say, "Wait a minute, is that apostrophe? Wait, here's an antidiplosis." And the whole sort of, and then we asked the question, well, why? Why would a man who is writing for people who don't believe he has a soul have to reach down deep into his heart and find linguistic capacity to make people see, and not just know, but to see and feel it? And all of a sudden it clicked. I mean, that's more of a high school type of assignment, but I think if your creative and intuitive homeschooling moms can think about how to scale those types of things, of assignments which are always at and along, I think you could make them age appropriate.
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly helpful principle. And obviously, I think even just hearing that first part of are you the type of professor who's making up lesson plans in the car? Every mom knows what it's like to walk from the kitchen with her coffee, figuring out the lesson of the day. And so I think we already have a pretty good gut handle on what way we probably lean. And in these early years, what a gift to be able to practice the art of doing at and along when we are working with a little bit easier subject matter at the table, and we're able to try and maybe fail. And the nice thing about your children is they're usually pretty generous and forgiving as you learn to teach. Yeah,
exactly. And we're so lucky to have so many amazing resources, right? In which if literature can be taught so beautifully along with writing, and we can enjoy the thing first. We can have the along experience, but then we can analyze it. We can break it down into individual parts. We can find particularly beautiful language. We can have the kids memorize bits and pieces. And then we can have activities in which it's done sort of like bullet pointy, but then turned back into a composition of their own. And then you have this kind of cool ecosystem, right, of beginning in admiration,
Mm-hmm.
moves to a type of analysis, then turns into an absorption, and then comes into a type of reproduction and a sort of
Mm-hmm.
apprenticeship model. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, a balanced ecology of
Yeah.
that, yeah, beginning from the admiration and ending in the admiration of story.
Right. I like that part that you're both starting and ending there. We always start with synthetic knowledge, particularly in the early years, first to love the thing. I usually use the language of like our posture needs to be one of an encounterer when we first come across things, this pre-modern view of the world, what, we're talking about this medieval mind a bit as well, so that then we can move into our analytic stage and learn how things work, which is just as beautiful, but not until first we've had this posture of wonder and a sense of beauty about it, which hopefully then learning about it ends us there as well. Like if you think about where you want to end at the end, it's humility and gratefulness for this gift that's been given. And so that's really helpful. I love that principle. Thank you. Now, for the mom who's listening, this is kind of a two-part question, who loves what you're saying, would love for this cosmic imaginary to rule her home, to be what her kids had, this medieval mind. For the mom who feels like this is not me, how would you say one recovers a mind, how they move in this path, or bringing our little ones along, how can we form them from the start in this direction?
Well, I'm married to a mom, and I know the types of things that she worries about and does well and gets discouraged about. So I guess maybe my first thing was, you are this type of mom,
Mm.
right? And that it's not too late, and too late is just despair. And anyone who loves can always love a little bit better, and that's the only thing we're trying to do. This is not about becoming knowledgeable or learned or some sort of sage. I mean, I think the reality is, I don't know, maybe I'm just not a very good professor, but look, I've spent, I don't know how many years, a couple decades doing this sort of thing. I have a PhD. I just feel like a complete beginner. And I think it's just a series of beginnings.
Mm.
And so it seems to me that love can overcome much, and that there are now like a million amazing resources. And the only thing you have to do on a daily and a weekly basis is improve 1%. I guess I'll leave it to your moms to decide if that's 1% improvement per day or per week. That per day might actually be a really steep improvement. But so I guess that would be the first thing. Second, I would just say favor real things over fake things. Favor, if you can, favor real painted religious icons over fake things. Listen to music which is uplifting the first 17 times that you do listen to it, and not is sort of spent after 3. Create, maybe here's a great atmosphere sort of, it's okay to tell your kids that they can't have smartphones until college.
Yeah.
Like, we've done it. It's okay. You can create what I want to call a culture of spaciousness, by which I mean, I'm going back to almost kind of full circle. In our modern period, we're always hitting the accelerator, right? We are a Newtonian culture, force equals mass times acceleration. And we are trying to do as much work as possible. And that's how we measure our success. Right. Our medieval ancestors measured their success in terms of creating eternity moments, or what I want to call moments in which spaciousness overcomes time. Now, this is something I think this is something that your moms can be particularly excited about. And doing that means, I think, sort of pushing those distracting devices for ourselves first, right? Can we prune our, I guess here's a way to do it. Do we use our technological tools in a way that improves us? Does it make us closer to other people? Does it bring us closer into communion with our God and with our family members and with ourselves? Are we less on the periphery of our being? Are we less sort of that kind of, bottomless scrolling anxiety? And I don't just mean the literal bottomless scrolling, even though that contributes to it, right? And more at peace, more mindful. I think all of these things could sort of contribute to, creating a culture of spaciousness. And the writers, they were also readers, but the writers that we love do this. I guess this is my final thought. Just as we have sort of technologies now, right? All kinds of wonderful power tools and apps and whatever you want to do, there's some sort of, labor enhancing device to help you achieve it. Our ancestors thought that way about the soul, and literature and art were the technologies which made the soul more magnanimous and the soul more spacious.
Mm.
So we can get those things into our house, and we can get real wood burning fireplaces, and we can get real family dinner times, and we can have real books read and real conversations and listen to real music and have real crafts. We can create a sense of spaciousness and a sense of communion. And we're all moving in that direction, with insincerity. But now we have just tons and tons of tools. So I guess I would just encourage your listeners not to be overwhelmed or discouraged that there are a lot of things, but be happy that there are so many good things, and that there are people like you who are so selective. That's such a gift, right? You're like a sommelier, right? You can come with pairings, right? May I recommend the sauterne with your cheesecake, right? I think that's an amazing thing, and that's a gift to help sort of navigate this ocean of materials, many of which are garbage, but some of which are just brilliant, and people just need to know about them and get access to them. So 1%.
1%.
1%.
That's great. So much in there. Moments of eternity, the spaciousness, but also that all of this is about right loves. We come back to this all of the time in our conversations at the Commonplace, that we are trying to rightly order our loves. It's the point of education. It's the point of what we're learning in motherhood, of caring for our children, constantly learning to order rightly, at the right time and at the right way. So I think that's incredibly encouraging. Thank you for that.
You're
Now,
welcome.
before I let you go, I have to know, who is your favorite character in the Narnia series? And also, what is your favorite Lewis book? You can't go. This is the biggest question of the day.
I'd probably change my answer to the second question on a weekly basis.
Well, today.
But currently, Voyage of the Dawn Treader is my favorite book.
Okay.
And I think the character I relate most to is Caspian.
Okay.
And
why?
he's super choleric, and he's a real adventurer, and he has a sense of justice. But the character I admire the most is Lucy. It's because she's a contemplative. She's the one who looks along the beam. Mm-hmm. She's the one who spends enough time in these conditions of spaciousness that she sees real and lasting things. Mm-hmm. And they don't flit away, but she studies them, and she draws them into herself, and they become part of her, and she's deep. So, yeah, there you go.
Great. Yes, Lucy is my favorite whole-souled person. My favorite ideal type for that.
Yes.
Okay, before you go, will you please share with us where we can find more of your work, and particularly your forthcoming book, which I'm pretty excited about?
Yes. I am working on a translation of Dante's Inferno. I've written about the philosophy guiding it on First Things, so that's easy to find. And I'm also working on a book on Brothers Karamazov, which is a reading of the Byzantine spiritual tradition underneath Brothers Karamazov. So it's not just a sort of look at Ivan's critique of God, but Father Zosima's answer. If your listeners are interested in either of those, they could follow me on Amazon, and Amazon will politely alert you when those items are available for purchase. I also have some popular articles and some interviews, which are available on my website, jasonmbaxter.com. And I also have some books for sale, my Dante books, my mysticism book, my Lewis book, which if your listeners are interested, I can sign that and mail it to them. And the thing that people like the most is that I wrap them in whatever discarded academic lecture I'd been giving to the students earlier that day, or whatever article I'd marked up and no longer need. Some of it's pretty random stuff. I know some people have got some crown illustrations from toddlers. But I think people like that because Jeff Bezos doesn't hand package his books in things that he's written and printed off himself. So I think people think that that's a sort of the mark of authenticity.
Yes, in this pursuit of humanizing living, we are looking for our books wrapped in discarded academic papers. I saw that in your bio, and it actually made me laugh out loud. Perfect. Dr. Baxter, thank you so much for joining us today. It was really wonderful to learn from you.
Thanks for your good work, and greetings to all your listeners.
Thank you. All right, everyone else, I'll see you in 2 weeks.